Historic meeting. Government officials and faith leaders from around the world gather in Washington to advance religious freedom. Midterm menace. Lawmakers talk about protecting the fall elections from foreign interference. Prayers for peace. A Catholic priest from Eritrea describes the role faith played in a peace agreement with Ethiopia. And family of faith. A vesting ceremony in New Orleans features a rare Catholic moment for a father and son. On EWTN News Nightly for Tuesday, July 24th, 2018. Good evening from Washington, D.C., and thank you to those of you joining us from around the world for news from a Catholic perspective. I'm Lauren Ashburn. The lack of religious freedom anywhere is a threat to peace, prosperity, and stability everywhere. And with those words, the State Department kicks off its first ever ministerial meeting on religious freedom. It brings together spiritual leaders from more than 80 countries and dozens of foreign ministers from around the world. Correspondent Wyatt Goolsbee was there. He's covering the event from the State Department. Good evening, Wyatt.
Good evening, Lauren. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo wants to unite people around the central issue. He says human rights and human dignity are closely linked to religious freedom, and he's joining the U.S. Ambassador at Large for International Religious Freedom with a clear message to the world.
Freedom of religion and the ability to live according to the dictates of your own soul is under attack in the world. This must change.
Ambassador Sam Brownback is challenging advocates. This week, he's welcoming people of all faiths, Christians, Muslims, Jews, Buddhists, to highlight religious persecution around the world. One of the key regions brought up on day one, Iraq. Johnny Moore, an evangelical advisor to President Trump, described his 2017 trip to the war-torn country.
And there was one refrain, again and again and again. Everyone we talked to, Yazidi or Christian or Mandaean, whatever it was, all across the region, everyone said the same thing. They just said they felt forgotten.
Talks today also focused on Pakistan, where Christians are treated as second-class citizens. Peter Badi's brother, Shabazz, was assassinated by extremists in 2011 in Islamabad. He was the only Catholic member of Pakistan's federal cabinet. Badi tells me his brother was killed because he stood up for the rights of religious minorities.
He has passion to bring justice, equality for our religion, all caste of creed. Everybody should be treated equal into the country.
Peter Badi says while he no longer lives in Pakistan, he's trying to advocate for the same cause his brother stood for. Blasphemy laws in the country are a particular problem. They prevent freedom of speech and could even lead to the death penalty for any negative comments against Islam. Christians are often the target. Lauren?
You will be covering this event for days to come. Who else will be speaking? What do you expect to hear?
Well, Lauren, it is shaping up to be a busy week. Tonight, Callista Gingrich, the U.S. ambassador to the Vatican, will emphasize the Catholic Church's push for religious freedom around the world. Tomorrow, we're watching USAID Administrator Martin Green, who will speak, so we're hoping to hear a little bit more about aid to Christians to the Middle East. And then finally, the big day and final day will be on Thursday, when we'll hear from Secretary of State Mike Pompeo and Vice President Mike Pence. Lauren?
Correspondent Wyatt Goolsbee reporting from the State Department. Thank you, Wyatt. President Trump tones down the aggressive rhetoric toward Iran a day after warning the country could face dire consequences for threatening the U.S. Today, the president indicates he is ready for Iran to come back to the negotiating table. White House correspondent Mark Irons reports. Good evening, Mark.
Good evening, Lauren. The president spoke to veterans in Kansas City today where he was applauded for pulling the U.S. out of the Iran nuclear deal. The White House says the president's main objective now is to keep Iran from obtaining nuclear weapons, but he wants to work out a different deal after keeping his campaign promise.
I withdrew the United States from the horrible, one-sided Iran nuclear deal. Iran is not the same country anymore. That I can say. And we'll see what happens. But we're ready to make a real deal, not the deal that was done by the previous administration, which was a disaster.
The president's remarks come a day after he used Twitter and threatened Iran's President Hassan Rouhani with, quote, consequences the likes of which few throughout history have ever suffered. That response came after Rouhani predicted a U.S. war with Iran would be the mother of all wars. And today the president is also expressing his appreciation to North Korea. Satellite images show the country may have begun dismantling parts of a launch site that plays a major role in North Korea's nuclear missile program. The president says the images are a sign his summit with North Korean leader Kim Jong-un seems to be going very well. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo cautions the dismantling, saying it still needs to be confirmed by international inspectors. Lauren?
After threatening Iran's leader yesterday, does the president hope to bring him to the negotiating table the same way he secured his meeting with Kim Jong-un? Or in other words, is this the storm before the calm?
Well, Lauren, you'll remember the president threatening North Korea with fire and fury, and that was months before he ended up sitting down with Kim Jong-un. The White House isn't saying if the president is following the same strategy as he tries to strike a new deal with Iran, but we know the president has used aggressive talk followed by a diplomatic approach before. Lauren?
White House correspondent Mark Irons, thank you. We will have analysis of the war of words between the United States and Iran coming up later in the show with Blaise Mishtal of the Bipartisan Policy Center.
Yeas are 86, the nays are 9. The nomination is confirmed.
The Senate last night confirmed Robert Wilkie as Secretary of the Department of Veterans Affairs. He was the agency's acting secretary. The 55-year-old served in both the Navy and Air Force Reserves. The Trump administration says it has reunited nearly 1,200 children who had been separated from their families at the U.S.-Mexico border, but hundreds more need to be returned to their parents before Thursday's court-imposed deadline. And President Trump says he's very concerned Russia will try to meddle in November's midterm elections to help Democrats. Lawmakers in both parties share concern about foreign interference, and they are looking at what action to take to ensure the voting process is secure. Capitol Hill correspondent Jason Calvi joins us. Good evening, Jason.
Good evening, Lauren. A top Homeland Security official tells lawmakers today Russia is not targeting election infrastructure like voting machines. Instead, he warns they're trying to influence voters. Still, Democrats didn't get their wish to publicly question President Trump's top intelligence chief.
This is the Oversight and Government Reform Committee, and we're abdicating ourselves from overseeing.
Democrats on the Oversight Committee failed to subpoena Director of National Intelligence Dan Coats, and they're accusing Republicans of trying to protect President Trump.
Do you stand for the right for your people to have a clean and honest election? Or do you want to cozy up to the president? You don't want to make him look bad. I can understand when there's gray issues, but this is black and white.
This Republican from Michigan says there's no evidence the Russians' interference impacted election results.
Not at federal level reporting, not at state level, indicated that votes were in any manner altered. There's no quarrel that outside entities, including Russia, attempted to interfere with our election. Conflating the two gets in the way of doing the job we're trying to do here.
Federal, state, and county election officials say they're working to keep the 2018 elections safe.
We work year-round to protect against direct hacking attempts that seek to improperly access voter rolls, remove election information from county websites, or alter voting data. We also work to protect voting machines, computers, and other equipment used to cast, record, tally, and certify votes.
New Mexico's Secretary of State says more money is needed.
This funding just provided through the omnibus bill wouldn't be enough to replace systems in a state that don't have paper ballot systems.
Secretary Toulouse Oliver is referring to money Congress approved in March, $380 million for state election security. It can be used for training, software, and machines. All 50 states have requested some of that money. Lauren?
Republicans have blocked more funding despite Democrats pushing for more. How are Republicans opposed?
Well, Wisconsin Representative Glenn Grothman tells me that the federal government is already in debt and the states have the money to provide for extra election security. But he says in the end he believes Republicans will give in and actually provide more money for this important issue.
Capitol Hill correspondent Jason Calvi. Thank you, Jason. Israel shoots down a Syrian fighter jet, saying it breached the country's airspace. Video shows the trails of 2 missiles that struck the plane. Syrian government forces, retaking territory from rebels, reached the Golan Heights frontier for the first time in 7 years. At least 74 people are dead and more than 100 injured after wildfires race through Athens, Greece. The blazes have torched cars, houses, and forests. The country's prime minister calls for 3 days of mourning, and the Vatican says Pope Francis is praying for the victims and their families. President Daniel Ortega of Nicaragua denies responsibility for recent attacks on the Catholic Church. Speaking in an interview last night with Fox News, Ortega said, quote, "Not a single Nicaraguan has died in a church." He also says he invites church leaders, to continue dialogue toward peace. The country's bishops met yesterday to talk about how to restart talks between the government and protesters. Chile has investigated nearly 160 members of the Catholic Church for committing or covering up sexual abuse against minors and adults. The investigations include reports of abuse by bishops, priests, and lay workers filed since 2000. Some of the cases date from 1960. The country's bishops say in a statement the focus must be on the victims. The probe follows an avalanche of sex abuse and cover-up cases that have rocked the church in that Catholic country. And for Catholics in East Africa, there is hope for a better life after an agreement between 2 war-torn countries. Earlier this month, the leaders of Ethiopia and Eritrea agreed to accept a peace deal signed 18 years ago and end the long-running war. Our Vatican correspondent Juliet Lindley talked to Father Musi Zerai from Eritrea. He lives in Rome. She asked what the deal means for migrants fleeing the region.
You were nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize in 2015, particularly for your work regarding migration. How much do you think this peace deal will change the migration crisis in your country and in your region of Africa?
Peace is the base. Now we need to start to build better future for our youth.
5% of Eritreans are Catholic. What were the main difficulties that Catholics faced?
Some few months ago, the authority he shut down our different activities in healthcare. More than 8 clinics totally closed. It's totally free service.
Why did they shut it down?
He say it's not necessary because we have our service, the state service, so he don't need.
But that has nothing to do with Ethiopia, so whether or not there is peace, that doesn't necessarily mean that this will change in your country.
With peace now, maybe even the internal policy, he changed. Our country without constitution, without basic law, so without freedom. Now, with peace, I hope the country, the government, he start to build this important infrastructure and structure.
What is your relationship with Pope Francis? How is he? You've met him, you've talked with him. How was that?
When he met me the first time, he say me, I say him, I am a Catholic priest from Eritrea, and he said, I remember when I visited Lampedusa, the first time I meet people from your country. So he said me, do your job, go to fight again of human trafficking.
Thank you, Father Musia. Thank you so very much.
You're welcome.
That was Juliet Lindley reporting. 11 of the 12 boys rescued from a flooded cave in Thailand are taking the first steps to become Buddhist monks. Their initiation was completed this afternoon in a ceremony. The boys will spend 9 days in the temple praying and offering works of charity. They want to give thanks for their safe return. The children and their soccer coach were rescued earlier this month after being stuck in a flooded cave for 18 days. Coming up, a congressman and former diplomat weighs in on the president's summit with Putin. And the last American bishop at Vatican II has died. House Speaker Paul Ryan says he will not invite Russian President Vladimir Putin to address Congress if Putin comes to Washington. Speaker Ryan says the ceremonial speech to Congress is something we reserve for allies. Trump has invited Putin to the White House this fall as a follow-up to their private meeting in Helsinki last week. Joining me is Representative Francis Rooney, Republican from Florida, and the former U.S. ambassador to the Holy See. Welcome back to the program.
Thanks for having me back on, Lauren.
There's already talk of another proposed summit between President Trump and President Putin. As a former U.S. ambassador to the Holy See, do you see that as advisable?
I absolutely do. You know, being a diplomat, I believe in dialogue. And we had dialogue with the Soviet Union all through the Cold War, which ultimately led to some very productive results. So I don't have any problem with the second summit. I just want to make sure we accomplish some tangible objectives concerning other problem spots in the world with the summit.
But how are we going to know that? The last high-level meeting between Trump and Putin, they didn't use transcripts, nothing was released, and it was only in private with translators present.
Well, I hope that he will, now that he's done this icebreaker meeting, he will revert to more the standard diplomatic meeting with note takers and pre-discussed position points so that we can try to see if we can't narrow some asymmetries in our relationship and gain a little help out of Russia, maybe with some of our other enemies like North Korea and Iran.
Just this month, U.S. intelligence officials indicted 12 Russian officers for interference with U.S. elections. Is it time to enact additional sanctions? There's a bill on the Senate, Senator Marco Rubio and Chris Van Hollen, for sanctions for Russian election meddling.
Yeah, I definitely think it is, you know, and I was involved with the effort to strengthen the Magnitsky Act last year. I think that Russia needs to pay a price for its meddling in the United States, just like they need to pay a price for their hegemonic aggression in the Ukraine.
Is there anything that can be done ahead of the upcoming elections? Tell us about what Florida has done to guard against election meddling.
Well, Florida's kind of a very progressive and forward-thinking state in terms of elections. The county election board's computers do not connect with the internet, so it's impossible to be hacked.
Before we let you go, tonight the historic meeting begins to advance international religious freedom. You are speaking. Why do you believe is religious freedom such an integral part of maintaining global stability?
Well, as we used to say in the Vatican, religious freedom's the first freedom. If you don't have religious freedom, it's pretty hard to sustain freedom of assembly, freedom of speech, etc. And we know that religious freedom is under attack in many parts of the world, especially parts of it in East Asia and more importantly in the Middle East. This is a good opportunity to highlight these challenges to religious freedom and hear from Ambassador Gingrich as well as Archbishop Gallagher.
When I spoke to Secretary of State Pompeo last week, I asked him, with religious freedom under attack in America, how can we take the moral high ground in promoting it across the world?
I think that's a very good question. We have to be true to ourselves here as well. We have to resist anti-Semitism, these radical reactionary groups that, like in Charlottesville, and we have to be willing to denounce them and stand up for people's rights to practice their religion and be free.
Representative Francis Rooney, Republican from Florida, former U.S. ambassador to the Holy See. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me on, Lauren. Have a good day.
You too. A controversial former Archbishop of Seattle has died. Raymond Hunthausen was the last surviving American bishop to participate in the Second Vatican Council during the 1960s. The Archbishop took an outspoken stance against nuclear weapons. He also championed gay rights and increased roles for women in the church and was investigated by the Vatican in the 1980s for a lack of clarity on church teaching. The Seattle Archdiocese calls him a humble and loving servant of the Lord and a man of peace. He was 96. Up next, we examine the war of words between Iran and the White House. And a son plays a hands-on role in helping his father. As Israel continues trying to prevent Iran from setting up camp next to the Syrian-Israeli border on the Golan Heights, and shot down a Syrian fighter jet that entered its airspace. The world is watching to see how the war of words between the U.S. and Iran plays out. Joining me now, Blaise Mistal, Director of National Security at the Bipartisan Policy Center. Blaise, welcome back to the program.
Always a pleasure, Lauren.
What's behind the recent war of words between the United States and Iran? Could this be a negotiating tactic?
I think it certainly is. If everyone remembers The Art of the Deal, President Trump's first book, this is textbook for him. Sort of strong rhetoric, being tough, trying to leverage your negotiating partner as hard as possible, but being willing to talk. We saw exactly this happen with North Korea play out over the last year.
And Little Rocket Man,
yeah, we went
tweeted to him.
Yeah, we went from Little Rocket Man and talking about the size of our nuclear buttons to the Singapore summit. I think we're seeing the same dynamic play out now with President Trump trying to strike a new deal with Iran.
How great of a risk of backfire is there?
Well, I'd point out that there is a big difference between a war of words and a real war. But it is a very tense situation, and it's not just between the United States and Iran. With Iran's presence throughout the region, in Iraq where we have troops, in Syria where we have troops, increasingly closer to the border with Israel and Syria, there is a very real possibility for tensions to flare up, as we saw just today with Israel shooting down a Syrian fighter jet.
We're now outside of the Iran nuclear deal constructed by the Obama administration. How will the impending economic sanctions, which will kick in about, I think, 2 weeks, impact U.S. relations with Iran?
Yeah, well, this is really important to understand because President Trump has torn up a lot of past diplomatic agreements, but the Iran deal is a little different, right? He tore up the Paris Climate Accords. He said we shouldn't even be talking about this. The Iran deal he tore up not because it's bad to have a deal with Iran constraining its nuclear program, but because the deal didn't go far enough in doing so, in his estimation. And so for him and for his administration, the strategy isn't just get out of the deal, but get a better, tougher deal in place to keep Iran from becoming a nuclear power. And so sanctions and negotiations and pressure on Iran has always been part of the strategy that they were planning after exiting the deal.
But what is the real leverage behind those sanctions? Who is affected?
Well, I think the leverage is the same as the leverage that was used to get the original Obama administration deal, which is that Iran, unlike North Korea, is not an isolated hermit kingdom. It is part of the international economy. By and large, it depends on oil exports and other forms of economic interaction to stay alive. And so if you cut off their oil, if you stop other countries from doing business with them, you're going to see the regime suffer. And as we've already seen for the last 6 months, you're going to see the population rise up against the regime. And that combination of economic pressure from outside and political pressure from inside is what the Trump administration is counting on, getting Iran back to the negotiating table.
Blaise Mistal, Director of National Security at the Bipartisan Policy Center. Always great to talk to you. Thanks,
Lauren.
And finally tonight, a seminarian in New Orleans takes a hands-on role in helping his father become a deacon. The New Orleans Advocate reports at the ordination, seminarian Andrew Gutierrez presented the deacon's vestments to his father, Martin Gutierrez. He was one of 22 permanent deacons installed last month at St. Louis Cathedral. The father, shown hugging his son, as we showed, says of the experience, "I cried like a little kid." And his son Andrew said, "I was filled with overwhelming peace, joy, and a sense of pride for my dad." What a heartwarming story. For all of us here at EWTN News Nightly, to all of you around the world, thank you for watching. I'm Lauren Ashburn. Let's keep in touch online. Follow me at Lauren Ashburn on Twitter and at Lauren Ashburn EWTN on Facebook. Good night and God bless.